What if losing your luggage led to uncovering a massive airport crime ring? Shaq was just trying to get home after a long flight, but when his suitcase vanished, things got suspicious fast. A nervous baggage handler whispered, "I think I know where it is, but you're not going to like it." Moments later, Shaq was standing in a restricted airport zone, staring at his ripped open bag, his expensive sneakers missing. Before he could react, a deep voice growled from behind him. "You shouldn't have come here, big guy." What happened next? Let's just say someone messed with the wrong man. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Shaq let out a deep sigh as he stepped off the plane, rolling his shoulders to shake off the stiffness from the long flight. He was used to traveling, but today, all he wanted was to get home, kick off his shoes, and relax. The overhead lights in the airport felt too bright, the hum of voices and rolling suitcases just background noise as he made his way toward the baggage claim. He pulled out his phone and scrolled absent-mindedly while waiting for the conveyor belt to start moving. The carousel whirred to life, and one by one suitcases tumbled onto the belt. Black, blue, red, patterned. Every bag except his. He waited. 10 minutes. 15. His brows furrowed as the last bag made its way around the loop, unclaimed. "Yo," he said, stepping toward an airline employee in a crisp uniform. "My bag's not here." The worker barely looked up. "What's your flight number?" Shaq gave it to him, tapping his foot impatiently as the man typed into the computer. The employee frowned at the screen before giving him a half-hearted shrug. "Looks like your bag is delayed. Check at the service counter." Shaq exhaled, trying to keep his patience. He was tired, but this wasn't his first time dealing with airport baggage issues. He made his way to the counter, where a woman was already helping a couple whose bags had also gone missing. "Excuse me," Shaq said when it was his turn. "They sent me here for my luggage." The woman barely glanced at him. "Fill out this form. If it turns up, we'll contact you." Shaq's jaw tightened. He wasn't some impatient traveler causing a scene, but he also wasn't going to be brushed off. "Nah, I need my bag. It's got some important stuff in there." "Sir," she said, exhaling sharply, clearly uninterested in his frustration. "There's nothing I can do except take down your information." He glanced at the other passengers who had lost their luggage. They were getting checked on, being reassured. Why was his case different? Before he could push further, another employee nearby spoke up. "Maybe Jake can help," the man muttered. "He knows more about what happens with missing bags." Shaq turned. "Who's Jake?" The employee pointed toward a baggage handler near a side entrance. A young guy in an airport uniform, slightly worn out, hands smudged with grease from hauling heavy bags all day. Shaq strode over, towering over the worker who looked up and froze. His eyes widened in recognition. Jake swallowed hard, suddenly nervous. "You good, man?" Shaq asked, noting the way the guy shifted uncomfortably. Yeah," Jake stammered. I think I know something about your bag." Shaq narrowed his eyes. "Yeah? What is it?" Jake hesitated, his fingers curled into fists at his sides. And then, just barely above a whisper, he said, "I don't think it's lost. I think it was taken." Jake's hands trembled slightly as he wiped them on his uniform. He had handled thousands of bags before, seen frustrated travelers yell at airport staff. But this was different. This was Shaquille O'Neal standing in front of him, looking directly at him with an expression that demanded answers. I, I'm really sorry about this, sir," Jake stammered, trying to sound professional, but the words came out awkward. "I'll personally check the system and see what's going on with your bag." Shaq crossed his arms. "You look nervous, man." Jake hesitated. I just, I've seen some things happen around here. Let me check." As he turned to the computer, Shaq took a good look at him. The kid looked worn out. His uniform was slightly ripped at the sleeve, his hair messy like he hadn't had a good night's sleep in weeks. He had the tired eyes of someone carrying a weight too heavy for his age. "Rough day?" Shaq asked. Jake chuckled dryly, typing into the system. "More like a rough year." Shaq didn't pry, but he noticed the way Jake's hands moved quickly over the keyboard, like he had done this 1,000 times before. The airport was chaotic, with travelers dragging suitcases and flight announcements echoing through the loudspeakers, but there was a strange stillness around them. Then Jake's fingers froze over the keyboard. His face paled. Shaq leaned in. What? Jake didn't respond immediately. His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. This, this can't be right. Shaq narrowed his eyes. Talk to me. Jake exhaled sharply and turned the monitor slightly so Shaq could see. Your bag isn't lost, sir. He hesitated, glancing around as if checking who was listening. It's not in the system at all. Shaq's brows knitted together. What do you mean, not in the system? Everything's in the system. Jake lowered his voice. Not if someone took it off the record. Shaq's jaw tightened. You saying someone stole it? Jake hesitated, his eyes flicking toward a nearby security camera. I don't know, but I've been working here long enough to know when something isn't right. Sometimes bags just disappear. Shaq took a slow breath, his mind racing. And nobody does anything about it? Jake clenched his jaw. I've tried. He looked at Shaq, guilt flickering in his expression. I've reported things before, but what? Shaq pressed. Jake hesitated, then shook his head. Let's just say, people who ask too many questions don't last long here. Shaq's gaze darkened. Something wasn't just off. It was wrong. Jake looked over his shoulder nervously. Look, I want to help you, but if I start digging too deep... Shaq studied him, then nodded. I get it. He wasn't about to put the kid in danger, but he also wasn't about to let this slide. Before Jake could say anything else, a deep voice cut through the air. What's going on here? Jake stiffened. His supervisor had arrived. Jake's hands hovered over the keyboard, his jaw tightening as he double-checked the system. His pulse quickened. This wasn't a simple mistake. Shaq's bag wasn't just lost. It was wiped from the system entirely. Shaq watched Jake's reaction carefully. The young baggage handler was clearly hiding something. Or maybe he was scared. Well? Shaq asked, raising an eyebrow. Jake hesitated before sighing. Sometimes, bags just go missing. Most of the time, they show up in the wrong terminal, get sent to the wrong airport, or, normal mistakes. Shaq folded his arms. And my bag? Jake swallowed. Your bag isn't in the system at all. Shaq let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. Let me guess. Somebody's trying to steal my sneakers? He was joking, but Jake didn't laugh. Instead, Jake glanced around nervously before leaning in. His voice was barely above a whisper. Sir, I know you think this is funny, but this isn't the first time something like this has happened. Shaq's smile faded. What do you mean? Jake exhaled and lowered his voice. There's been a security issue. Luggage, expensive luggage, has been disappearing from this airport for months. Shaq's jaw tightened. And nobody's done anything? Jake scoffed. You think I haven't tried? People file reports, but nothing happens. The passengers never get their stuff back, and the security footage always seems to malfunction at the wrong time. Shaq studied Jake carefully. He wasn't lying, but he was afraid, not of Shaq, but of something bigger. Shaq's voice dropped. You know who's doing it, don't you? Jake hesitated. He cut himself off, shaking his head. I don't know anything for sure, but I have my suspicions. Shaq's eyes narrowed. All right, Jake. No more games. Who's really behind this? Jake opened his mouth, but before he could say anything, a loud voice boomed from behind them. What's going on here? Jake froze. Shaq turned slowly to see a man in a crisp supervisor's uniform walking toward them. His eyes locked onto Jake like a predator spotting prey. Jake swallowed hard. Just helping a passenger, sir. The supervisor's gaze flicked to Shaq, recognition flashing in his eyes before he smirked. Well, Mr. O'Neal, didn't expect to see you here. Shaq didn't smile. Yeah, well, I didn't expect to lose my luggage either. The supervisor's smirk didn't fade. I'm sure it'll turn up. No need to trouble my employees. He looked at Jake sharply. You should get back to work. Jake stiffened, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Shaq didn't like this. Something was off. As the supervisor walked away, he leaned in toward Jake and whispered something. Shaq saw Jake's face drain of color. Shaq frowned. What did he just say? Jake hesitated, then whispered back. He told me to drop it. Jake's hands trembled slightly as he exhaled. He glanced over his shoulder, his eyes darting nervously across the baggage claim area. The sound of conveyor belts whirring and the occasional crackling announcement filled the space, but it wasn't enough to mask the tension thickening in the air. Shaq tilted his head. "You good, man?" Jake hesitated before nodding, but it was clear he was anything but good. "Listen," Jake said, lowering his voice. "I shouldn't be telling you this, but your bag isn't just missing. It was taken." Shaq narrowed his eyes. "Taken? By who?" Jake swallowed. "Some people who work here, baggage handlers, security guys. They've been running this scam for months. Expensive bags go missing, and by the time anyone files a claim, the stuff inside is long gone." Shaq let out a slow breath. He knew something shady was happening. "And you know where my bag is?" Jake nodded, but he looked even more uneasy now. "I think so. There's a storage area where they keep luggage that's delayed. It's a cover. The real high-end stuff never makes it to Lost and Found." Shaq's expression hardened. "All right, show me." Jake's eyes widened. "Wait, what?" Shaq folded his arms. "You just said you know where my bag is, so let's go get it." Jake took a step back. "Man, I don't know if that's a good idea. These guys, they're not just stealing luggage. They make sure people don't ask questions." Shaq leaned in slightly. "You asking questions?" Jake let out a dry laugh. "Not if I want to keep my job." Shaq placed a firm hand on Jake's shoulder. "Look, kid, you're already in this. You either keep letting these guys push you around, or we handle this now." Jake's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. His fingers tapped against the counter in a nervous rhythm before he finally nodded. "All right, but we gotta be careful." Shaq smirked. "Man, you're with me. We are careful." Jake gave him a skeptical look, but sighed. "Follow me." They started walking toward a back hallway near the service entrance, dodging passengers dragging their suitcases and airline employees hustling between flights. The further they walked, the quieter the airport became. Just as they reached a door labeled "Authorized Personnel Only," Jake reached into his pocket, fumbling with a keycard. "Wait," Shaq said, frowning. "Why do you have access to this?" Jake sighed. "Because I used to." A sharp voice cut through the air. "Jake!" Both of them froze. Jake's supervisor, Randall, was storming toward them, and he did not look happy. Jake's face drained of color as the sharp voice rang through the corridor. "Jake!" Shaq turned just as a broad-shouldered man in his 50s stormed toward them. His dark blue airport-issued blazer barely contained his heavy frame, and the deep-set lines in his forehead told the story of a man who had spent years barking orders rather than taking them. Jake stiffened. "Mr. Randall." Randall's eyes flicked between the two men before settling on Shaq. He forced a tight, practiced smile, the kind people put on when they were trying to hide something. "Mr. O'Neal, sir, I apologize for the delay with your luggage. We're doing everything we can to locate it." His voice dripped with fake politeness, but Shaq caught the way his jaw clenched slightly when he said "doing everything we can." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "That right?" Randall turned to Jake, his polite mask slipping into something much colder. "And what exactly do you think you're doing?" Jake swallowed hard. Just trying to help Mr. O'Neal find his luggage." Randall's nostrils flared. "By taking him into a restricted area?" His voice dropped lower, and his eyes narrowed into a warning glare. Shaq folded his arms, stepping slightly in front of Jake. "I told him to take me here," he said, his voice steady. "Problem?" Randall let out a small, forced chuckle. "Oh, no, sir. No problem at all. But this is not how things work. We have policies in place. Procedures." He shot Jake another glare. "And some employees forget their place." Jake looked down, avoiding Randall's stare. Shaq caught that. Something was wrong. Randall cleared his throat and turned back to Shaq. "I assure you, Mr. O'Neal, we take all lost luggage matters very seriously. If you'd like, I can personally look into this and have your items delivered to your home." Shaq studied him. "And what about all the other bags that have been going missing?" Randall didn't flinch, but his fingers twitched slightly at his sides. A small reaction, but Shaq noticed. "I don't know what you mean," Randall said smoothly, "but I can assure you, no luggage is going missing." Shaq let the silence stretch between them for a moment. Randall turned back to Jake. "You've wasted enough time. Get back to work." Jake hesitated. Randall's eyes darkened. "Now." Jake nodded quickly. "Yes, sir." Randall smiled again. Though this time, there was something in his expression that made Shaq's skin crawl. "Pleasure meeting you, Mr. O'Neal," Randall said before stepping past them. But just as he passed Jake, he leaned in close to his ear. Shaq didn't hear what he said, but he saw Jake's shoulders tense and his fists clench at his sides. Randall walked away without another word. Jake let out a shaky breath. "What did he say?" Shaq asked. Jake stared straight ahead, his voice barely above a whisper. "Stay out of this." Jake's hands were still clenched at his sides, Randall's warning replaying in his mind. "Stay out of this." He knew exactly what that meant. He'd seen what happened to employees who asked too many questions. They either got fired for some made-up reason or suddenly stopped showing up altogether. But as he turned back to Shaq, something in the big man's expression made him pause. Shaq wasn't just another passenger who'd lost his bag. He wasn't walking away. "All right," Shaq said, his deep voice steady. "Let's get my bag back." Jake hesitated. "Man, Randall's not someone you mess with." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "Neither am I." For a second, Jake almost smiled. Almost. He glanced around the baggage claim area, making sure no one was watching. Then he sighed and motioned for Shaq to follow him. "I'll show you where they stash the unclaimed bags," he muttered. Shaq nodded and fell in step beside him. They walked through a staff-only door, stepping into a dimly lit hallway. The further they went, the quieter the airport noise became. Jake led them through another door, revealing a large storage room stacked with hundreds of suitcases, some covered in dust, others looking like they'd been rifled through. Shaq frowned. "This where they dump lost luggage?" Jake nodded. "Yeah, but it's more than that." He pulled out his phone and scrolled through some photos. "I started noticing a pattern. Expensive bags go missing, but they don't stay lost." Shaq glanced at the photos. Designer luggage, high-end brands, all tagged as unclaimed. But some were disappearing from the system altogether. Jake continued. "Randall's got a group of guys working under him. They mark certain bags as abandoned, and then they take them." Shaq finished, his jaw tightening. Jake nodded. "But they're careful. They don't take the whole bag, just the valuables inside. Then they put the empty suitcase back." Shaq exhaled slowly. His bag wasn't lost. It was stolen. Jake walked deeper into the room, searching. "If your bag's still here, it'll be in this section." Shaq followed, his sharp eyes scanning the stacks of luggage. His patience was running out. Then Jake froze. "There!" He pointed to a black duffel bag sitting on top of a pile. The tag had been ripped off, but there was no mistaking it. It was Shaq's. Shaq stepped forward and unzipped it. Empty. His expensive sneakers? Gone. His custom sunglasses? Gone. Even his limited edition watch had been taken. Jake muttered a curse under his breath. "I knew it." Shaq slowly zipped the bag shut, his expression unreadable. But Jake could tell. Shaq wasn't letting this slide. Then, a noise. Footsteps. Jake's heart slammed against his ribs. "Someone's coming," Shaq murmured. They both turned toward the door. It was locked. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. He and Shaq stood frozen in the dimly lit storage room, surrounded by stacks of abandoned suitcases. The footsteps outside grew louder, closer. Then, the door burst open. Standing in the doorway, arms crossed, was Randall. And he wasn't alone. Two security guards flanked him, both wearing stone-cold expressions. Randall's gaze swept across the room before settling on Shaq's open duffel bag. A slow smirk spread across his face. "You shouldn't have come here, big guy." Shaq didn't flinch. He simply folded his arms and stared Randall down. Jake, on the other hand, was already calculating his escape. Randall took a step inside, the guards following behind him, effectively blocking the exit. "This is a restricted area," Randall continued, his voice low and threatening. "You two have no business here." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "That's funny, 'cause my business is all over this place." Randall's smirk faltered for just a second. His eyes darted to the torn-open duffel bag, then to Jake, who was still gripping his phone tightly. "You think you're some kind of detective?" Randall scoffed. "A missing bag doesn't mean theft." Jake clenched his jaw. "No? Then why are expensive items disappearing from certain bags? Why are they marked unclaimed, but never make it to lost and found?" Randall's expression darkened. "Careful, kid." Shaq stepped forward. The air in the room shifted. Randall wasn't used to people pushing back. But Shaq, he wasn't backing down. "Tell me, Randall," Shaq said, voice steady. "How much are you making off this little side hustle?" Randall's jaw tightened. The security guards shifted uneasily. "I don't know what you're talking about," Randall snapped. "Now, unless you want to miss your next flight, I suggest you leave." Jake suddenly moved past Shaq, reaching toward something. Randall's head snapped toward him. "What the hell do you think you're—" Jake held up a small black device. Shaq's eyes narrowed. "What is that?" Jake turned it over in his hands. A hidden camera. Randall's face drained of color. Jake glanced up at him. "Still want to act like nothing's going on?" Randall's hands clenched into fists. For a moment it looked like he was going to lunge at Jake, but Shaq stepped between them. "You touch him," Shaq said, "and you won't like what happens next." Randall swallowed hard. His grip loosened. The security guards exchanged uneasy glances. They weren't so sure about backing Randall anymore. Jake smirked. "Guess we should check what's on this footage, huh?" Randall's face twisted in anger. But before he could speak, a voice crackled over the airport intercom. "Security to baggage claim. Repeat, security to baggage claim." Randall stiffened. Shaq grinned. "Looks like your time's up." "This kid is the thief." Randall's voice boomed through the storage room, his finger jabbing toward Jake. Jake's mouth fell open. "What?" Shaq let out a deep, disbelieving chuckle. "That's your play? Blame him." Randall folded his arms, forcing confidence into his voice. "I've had my eye on him for weeks. He's been sneaking into storage, finding bags that were misplaced. He's the reason things go missing." Jake's face burned red. "That's a damn lie, and you know it." Randall shrugged. "All I know is—" Shaq held up a hand. "All right, enough." The room went silent. The tension was suffocating. Then Shaq turned to the security guards. "There's an easy way to settle this," he said. "Let's check the security footage." Randall's body visibly stiffened. The security guards hesitated, exchanging unsure looks. Then one of them, a younger guy with a name tag that read Mason, finally spoke. Yeah, we can do that." Randall's eyes darted toward him, his jaw clenched. Mason swallowed hard and looked at the other guard. "You think it's fair, right? If Jake's the thief, the footage will prove it." The second guard nodded slowly. Randall's lips pressed together, but he forced a smirk. "Fine, let's watch." The small office smelled like stale coffee and cheap air freshener. Mason sat at the desk, fingers clicking through files on the computer. Shaq, Jake, and Randall stood behind him, watching the monitor. Randall looked confident, too confident. Shaq narrowed his eyes. "What are you so sure about?" "All right," Mason mumbled. "Here's the last few nights from storage." He clicked on a file labeled Baggage Bay Camera 4 and hit play. The grainy footage loaded up. A dimly lit storage room appeared, the very one they had just been standing in. A man entered the frame. Everyone leaned forward. The figure walked to a row of suitcases, then casually unzipped one and started rummaging through it. Jake gasped. "That's not me!" Because it wasn't. The man in the footage turned toward the camera. It was Randall. Jake exhaled sharply. Shaq's expression didn't change, but his eyes flickered with quiet satisfaction. The recording continued. Randall pulled out a designer handbag, a jewelry box, and a pair of brand new sneakers. He shoved them into a black duffel bag. Then he walked off like nothing happened, clear as day. The room went silent. Randall's smirk had vanished. His face was ghost white. Mason froze in place. "Well, damn," Shaq grinned. "Something you want to say, Randall?" Randall staggered back. His mouth opened and closed, like a fish out of water. Then he turned and bolted for the door. Randall's feet pounded against the floor as he bolted for the door. "Stop him!" Shaq's deep voice boomed through the small security office. Randall yanked the door open, but he didn't get far. Two uniformed airport security guards were already outside, standing like brick walls. Randall skidded to a halt, eyes darting between them. I was just going somewhere?" one of the guards asked, stepping forward. Randall's hands twitched at his sides like he was considering making a run for it anyway. But then Mason's voice cut through the tension. "We just saw the footage, Randall." Randall's shoulders slumped. His face turned red, but he forced a laugh. "Oh, come on, guys," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "This is all a misunderstanding." Shaq crossed his arms. "Yeah? What part was misunderstood? The part where you stole bags or the part where you blamed Jake?" Randall opened his mouth but quickly shut it. The guards exchanged looks, then one reached for his radio. "This is Officer Grant," the guard said into his walkie-talkie. "We need airport police at baggage claim. Now." Randall flinched. Wait, he stammered, raising his hands. "Come on, let's talk about this." Shaq smirked. "We're talking." Randall's eyes darted around the room, searching for a way out. His usual smugness crumbled under the weight of Shaq's stare. Jake, who had been silent this whole time, finally spoke. His voice was shaky. "I thought I was going to lose my job," he murmured. Randall spun toward him. "Jake, buddy, come on. Don't listen to them. You and me, we've worked together for years." Jake's jaw tightened. He looked at the security guards, then at Shaq. Then he shook his head. "You would have let them fire me." Randall inhaled sharply. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. Then two airport police officers appeared. One officer, a tall woman with a no-nonsense expression, stepped forward. "Randall Jensen?" Randall gulped. "Yeah? You're under arrest for theft, fraud, and employee misconduct." Randall's eyes bulged. "Wait, no? This is crazy. This is just luggage. It's not like I—" The second officer snapped cuffs around his wrists. Randall's protest cut off instantly. The whole room watched in silence. Shaq stepped forward, towering over Randall. "You know, you could have just been honest." Randall looked up at him, defeated. He had no comeback, no excuses left. As the officers led him out of the room, Shaq turned to Jake. "You're not losing your job," Shaq said, smiling. Jake blinked in shock. "I'm not?" Shaq clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Nah, you're getting a new one." Jake stood there, still trying to process what had just happened. Randall was gone, hauled away in handcuffs. The weight of months, maybe years, of mistreatment at work was suddenly lifted. But now what? Shaq watched him closely, reading the emotions flickering across his face. "You good, man?" Shaq asked. Jake let out a shaky breath. "Yeah, I didn't think I'd have a job tomorrow." Shaq smirked. "Who said anything about tomorrow?" Jake frowned. "Wait, what do you mean?" Shaq crossed his arms. "Let me ask you something. How long you been working this job?" 3 years, Jake said. "And you been living paycheck to paycheck?" Jake hesitated before nodding. "Yeah, my mom's sick. I help take care of her, so I work extra shifts. This job ain't great, but it's steady." Shaq nodded, as if he'd expected that answer. "And you ever get promoted?" Jake laughed bitterly. "Randall made sure that never happened." Shaq shook his head. "Man, I knew he was bad, but keeping you stuck like that, that's some weak leadership." Jake shrugged. "It's life. I just do what I gotta do." Shaq grinned. "I like that. You're a worker. But let me tell you something. You deserve better than this dump." Jake looked up, confused. "What do you mean?" Shaq pulled out his phone. "I got a buddy. Owns a logistics company. Real good people. And guess what? They're hiring." Jake's eyes widened. "Wait, are you saying—" "I'm saying," Shaq interrupted, "I just called him and you got an interview. High pay, real benefits, and none of that Randall-type nonsense." Jake took a step back, shaking his head. I don't know, man. I don't want a handout." Shaq chuckled. "Good, 'cause it ain't a handout. It's an opportunity, but it's up to you if you take it." Jake's hands clenched at his sides. "This is real? Like for real?" Shaq nodded. "For real. You show up, you put in the work, and you'll have a career, not just a job." Jake's throat tightened. He looked down, taking a moment to breathe. I don't even know what to say," he muttered. Shaq patted his shoulder. "Say yes. Then go home. Tell your mom things are about to change." Jake blinked back tears, then nodded firmly. "Yes, I'll do it." Shaq smirked. "That's what I thought." Jake exhaled a shaky breath, still processing everything. Then Shaq lifted his phone again. "Now," he said, grinning, "let's make this official." Jake sat in his tiny apartment that night, staring at the piece of paper in his hands. It wasn't much, just an address and a time. But it was more than that. It was a chance, a shot at something better, something real. His mother, lying on the worn-out couch, looked over at him. "You've been quiet since you got home," she said gently. "What's on your mind, baby?" Jake exhaled and turned to her. "Ma, you're not going to believe this." She sat up slowly, wincing as she did. Her illness had drained her strength over the years, but she still looked at Jake with sharp, knowing eyes. "Try me." Jake ran a hand through his hair. "You know how I always said that job at the airport was just temporary? That one day I'd find something better?" His mother smiled. "Course, baby, you're too smart to be pushing bags around forever." Jake swallowed. "Shaq, he made a call. Got me an interview. It's a real job, Ma. A career. Benefits, salary, stability. No more living check to check." His mother's face softened, her lips trembling. "Jake, are you serious?" He nodded, his voice thick. "Yeah, Ma, it's real." Tears welled in her eyes, but she quickly wiped them away. "Then you better not mess it up," she said, forcing a teasing smile. Jake chuckled. "Wouldn't dream of it." The next morning, he stood in front of the towering glass building, adjusting his only dress shirt. The logistics company Shaq had set him up with wasn't just any small business. It was a major operation. He took a deep breath and walked inside. The receptionist greeted him warmly, directing him to a sleek conference room. Jake sat, bouncing his knee nervously. Was this really happening? Minutes later, a well-dressed man in his 50s entered. "Jake, right? I'm Mr. Caldwell, CEO. Shaq speaks very highly of you." Jake's heart skipped a beat. Yes, sir. It's an honor to be here." Caldwell smiled. "Relax, son. Shaq told me about your work ethic. Said you've been running that airport behind the scenes." Jake chuckled nervously. "I wouldn't say that, but I worked hard, yeah. That's exactly what we need. Someone who knows how to handle pressure, adapt, and get things done." Jake sat up straighter. "I can do that, sir." Caldwell studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Then welcome to the team." Jake blinked. "Wait, just like that?" Caldwell smirked. "Shaq doesn't vouch for just anyone. If he says you're solid, that's good enough for me." Jake felt his chest tighten. "Thank you, sir. I won't let you down." Caldwell extended his hand. "I know you won't." As Jake left the office, he pulled out his phone and texted Shaq. "I got the job." Seconds later, Shaq replied, "Told you. Now go be great." Jake stood outside the glass doors of his new office building, taking a deep breath. A week ago, he was a baggage handler, barely making ends meet. Now he was about to step into a world he never thought he'd be part of. His hands clenched slightly at his sides, not out of fear, but determination. As he pushed open the doors, the receptionist greeted him with a warm smile. "Welcome back, Mr. Carter. Your new supervisor will be here shortly." Mr. Carter. That was new. No one had ever called him that before. It made him stand a little taller. The past few days had been a whirlwind. News of Shaq's lost luggage, the hidden theft ring, and Randall's arrest had gone viral. The Shaq story was all over social media, with headlines like, "NBA legend exposes airport corruption," "Shaq loses luggage, finds a new friend instead," "From baggage to boardroom, how one act of kindness changed a life." Jake's phone had been blowing up with messages from old coworkers, friends he hadn't heard from in years. Everyone wanted to know how it felt to have Shaq as his personal guardian angel. But what meant the most was his mother. The night he told her he got the job, she cried. Not because they were finally getting out of financial struggle, but because for the first time, her son was being recognized for the hard-working man he was. Now, standing in his new office, Jake promised himself he wouldn't waste this opportunity. A man in a crisp navy blue suit approached. "Jake, welcome aboard," he said, shaking his hand. "I'm Mr. Reynolds, head of operations." "Nice to meet you, sir," Jake replied. "We're excited to have you. Shaq spoke highly of you. Said you were the kind of guy who doesn't back down from a challenge." Jake chuckled. "I try my best." Reynolds patted his shoulder. "That's exactly what we need." As Jake settled into his role, the transition from lifting luggage to logistics planning wasn't easy, but he embraced the challenge. For the first time in years, he felt like his future wasn't just a cycle of exhaustion, it had direction. 1 week later, Jake had just finished his first big assignment when his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Come outside." Frowning, he grabbed his jacket and stepped out onto the sidewalk. A sleek black SUV was parked at the curb. The tinted window rolled down and there he was. Shaq grinned. "Yo, you still got my luggage? Or should I be worried?" Jake laughed, shaking his head. "Man, I think I'm permanently banned from baggage handling." Shaq motioned to the car. "Get in. Let's grab some food." Jake hesitated. "Shaq, you've already done more for me than I could ever." Shaq held up a massive hand. "Stop. You earned this. You didn't ask for favors. You handled yourself like a man. Now come on, I'm starving." Jake grinned and slid into the car. As they drove, Shaq leaned back. "You know, man, life's funny. One lost bag and now look at you." Jake nodded. "Yeah, crazy how one moment can change everything." Shaq smiled. "That's the thing, Jake. You never know who might change your life, or whose life you might change."